It was not easy for us to share this testimony because the miracle God performed through this experience defies human understanding. What happened shook an entire community and raised questions that even respected religious leaders could not explain. Many who witnessed it began to question everything they once believed. But beyond the miracle itself, Jesus revealed one powerful secret that every believer must understand and apply if they truly desire to encounter God's power. Before you continue, quickly tell us the exact time according to your time zone and the location you are watching from. Our prayer team will be praying specially for you and your family. Please do not watch this casually. Stay with us until the very end, because what you are about to hear may change your life forever. Now here is the story. My name is Karim Musa, and I grew up in Ongwandoka, a small village outside Jos Plateau State. Everybody in our area knew me as the boy who hated Christians. Even though I was only 23 then, older men respected me because I could argue loudly against the Bible without fear. I enjoyed embarrassing believers in public. Whenever I saw street preachers, I stopped to challenge them. Whenever my younger sister Mary talked about Jesus, I mocked her until she cried. Looking back now, I realized something was already wrong inside my heart long before that terrible night happened. It started on a cold Thursday evening in November. News had spread across nearby villages that a large Christian crusade was happening near the mountain valley outside Kafanchan. People said thousands were gathering there. Some claimed the sick were being healed. Others said strange things happened whenever the preacher prayed. To me, it sounded like another opportunity to expose Christians as liars. That afternoon, I sat with my friends outside Al-Haji Bako's tea shop while dust blew across the road. My friend Sani laughed and slapped my shoulder, saying we should attend to the crusade and ask hard questions in front of everybody. Another friend joked that if Jesus truly had power, then he should prove it openly. We all laughed loudly. I still remember the proud feeling in my chest as people around us listened. Before sunset, we entered an old crowded bus heading toward the valley. The road was rough and filled with stones, but inside the bus people kept discussing the crusade. Some were excited. Others mocked openly like us. One elderly woman sitting near the back quietly held a small Bible against her chest. I noticed her lips moving in prayer while everyone else laughed around her. Something about her calmness annoyed me. During the journey, I stood up inside the moving bus and shouted jokingly for everyone to hear that if Jesus was truly alive, then tonight would be his chance to show himself. The entire bus exploded with laughter. Even the driver laughed so hard that he almost missed the bend in the road. But the old woman did not laugh. She simply looked at me with sad eyes and softly said that some people only recognize danger after it reaches them. Those words stayed in my mind longer than I wanted to admit. By the time we arrived, night had already covered the mountains. The air was cold. Thousands of people filled the open field. Bright lights pointed toward a large stage built near the rocky hills. Worship music echoed through the valley while people prayed, cried, danced, and raised their hands toward heaven. I had never seen such a massive gathering before in my life. Yet instead of feeling fear, I felt anger. I remember pushing through the crowd with my friends while mocking the worshipers around us. Some ignored us. Some looked uncomfortable. One young man told us respectfully not to disturb others who came to pray. That only made us laugh harder. Then suddenly, as I turned near the front row, I froze. Standing only a few meters away from me was my younger sister, the same sister I had insulted many times for reading the Bible secretly at home. The same sister I warned never to speak to me about Jesus again. The moment she saw me, fear entered her face immediately. "Kareem, what are you doing here?" she asked quietly. I smirked and folded my arms. I told her I came to watch the fake miracles with my own eyes. I told her tonight everybody would finally see the truth. But instead of arguing, Mary only stared at me silently, with tears forming in her eyes. Then she said something that disturbed me deeply. She said she had been praying for me for many months, because she believed one day God would allow me to see what pride was hiding from me. I laughed in her face. But honestly, something inside me suddenly became uncomfortable. And I had no idea that before that night ended, my entire life was about to collapse in front of thousands of people. After speaking with Mary, I tried to act strong in front of my friends. But deep inside me, something had already changed slightly. I cannot fully explain it, even today. The atmosphere in that valley was different from anything I had experienced before. The cold wind moved through the mountains slowly, while thousands of voices worshiped together under the dark sky. Everywhere I looked, people were praying seriously. Some were kneeling on the ground crying openly. Others held their Bibles tightly as if their lives depended on it. I remember looking at all of them with confusion because these people did not behave like actors. Their emotions looked real. Their prayers sounded real. Yet my pride refused to let me admit it. My friends continued mocking loudly beside me. Sani kept laughing whenever the worship leader mentioned the name of Jesus. Another friend named Bashir shouted jokingly that if miracles truly happened there, then somebody should make rain fall immediately. Some people around us turned angrily, but nobody argued with us. Instead, many simply looked at us with pity. That annoyed me even more because I hated feeling like people were silently judging my heart. The crusade continued for some time before the preacher finally walked onto the stage. The moment he appeared, the crowd became quiet. He was not dressed like the rich pastors I expected. He wore a simple dark suit and carried an old Bible in his hand. Even from where I stood, I could see tiredness on his face. Yet, there was something calm and serious about him that made people listen carefully. He did not begin by shouting. He simply greeted everyone softly and started speaking about how pride can blind a person spiritually without them realizing it. At first, I laughed quietly and whispered to my friends that every preacher says the same thing. But then the man suddenly began describing people who insult God publicly while secretly carrying pain and emptiness inside them. He spoke about people who attack believers, not because they are strong, but because deep down they are afraid that God might actually be real. Every sentence felt strangely personal to me. My chest became uncomfortable. Then something happened that shook me deeply. The preacher suddenly paused during his message and pointed toward the crowd. His eyes moved slowly across thousands of people until they stopped somewhere near where I was standing. Even though he could not possibly know me, I felt as if he was staring directly into my soul. In a calm voice, he said, there was a young man in the gathering who had spent years fighting against Jesus because anger had hardened his heart after many disappointments in life. He said this person mocked Christians publicly, but cried secretly whenever he was alone at night. He said this person believed God had abandoned his family during suffering, and because of that, bitterness entered him slowly. The moment those words entered my ears, my body became cold. I immediately remembered the year my mother became seriously sick. I remembered watching Christians pray for her while nothing changed immediately. I remembered the anger that entered my heart afterward. I remembered blaming God for everything. Nobody beside me knew those thoughts except me. Suddenly, I could no longer laugh. I looked around nervously while my friends still joked carelessly beside me. My breathing became heavier. For the first time that night, I wanted to leave the crusade completely. But before I could move, thunder rolled loudly across the mountains. The entire valley became silent. Dark clouds had gathered above us without most people noticing. The cold wind became stronger. Dust moved across the open field while plastic chairs shook slightly. Some people lifted their heads toward the sky nervously. Then the preacher spoke again, but this time his voice sounded heavier. He said God was merciful, but people should never play with repeated warnings because there are moments when heaven allows people to face the darkness they keep choosing. The moment he said those words, fear touched my heart for the first time. I tried convincing myself it was only emotion. I told myself nothing unusual would happen. Yet deep inside me, I felt trapped between pride and fear. Part of me wanted to leave immediately. Another part refused because I did not want my friends to think I was weak. Then Mary suddenly appeared beside me again through the crowd. Her eyes were already filled with tears. She grabbed my hand tightly and begged me softly to stop mocking and simply listen carefully for once in my life. She told me she did not know why, but her heart felt troubled since she saw me that evening. I pulled my hand away angrily and told her nothing would happen to me. But the truth was this: for the first time in many years, I was no longer completely sure of myself. And only a few minutes later, the first scream came from the back of the crowd. At first, nobody paid attention to the scream because the crusade ground was already noisy. Children were crying, people were praying loudly, generators were vibrating near the stage, and the wind kept pushing dust through the valley. But then the scream came again, louder this time, filled with a kind of terror that immediately silenced the people nearby. I turned toward the back of the crowd and saw a young man stumbling between rows of plastic chairs with both hands stretched forward desperately. His face looked completely broken with fear as he shouted that he could not see anything anymore. Some people thought he was joking at first, but the panic in his voice was too real to ignore. The people around him quickly moved backward, while others tried holding him before he fell to the ground. The atmosphere changed immediately. I remember the exact feeling that entered my chest at that moment. It felt as if the entire valley suddenly became colder. Even my friends stopped laughing for the first time that night. The preacher on the stage became quiet and simply watched the crowd carefully without saying anything for several seconds. Then another scream suddenly came from the left side of the gathering. This time it was a woman. She dropped to her knees while crying uncontrollably and covering her eyes with both hands. Her husband held her shoulders tightly, asking what happened, but she kept shouting that darkness had covered her sight completely. Fear spread through the crowd like fire. People began turning around nervously. Some started praying loudly. Others tried leaving quickly. I heard someone behind me say, maybe it was a spiritual attack. Another person said perhaps the bright floodlights damaged people's eyes. But before anybody could understand what was happening, a third person began screaming near the center of the field. Chairs started falling over as people pushed themselves backward in confusion. Children cried loudly while mothers grabbed them tightly against their chests. Even the workers near the stage frightened. Then thunder exploded above the mountains again. The lightning was so bright that for 1 second the entire valley became white. I still remember seeing terrified faces everywhere around me during that flash. Some people were kneeling already. Some were crying openly. Others stood frozen completely. And in the middle of all that confusion, the preacher slowly lifted his microphone and spoke with a voice so calm that it frightened me more than the screams themselves. He said softly that the gathering was not a place for entertainment, and that some people were treating holy things carelessly, without understanding the danger of mocking what they did not truly understand. The moment he said those words, my heart began beating violently. Suddenly, every joke I'd made earlier started replaying inside my mind. I remembered standing inside the bus, mocking Jesus publicly. I remembered insulting Mary many times at home. I remembered tearing one of her Bible study notebooks months earlier while she cried helplessly. I remembered laughing when my sick mother asked me to join her during prayer one evening. At that time, I thought I was strong and intelligent. But standing there in that valley, surrounded by terrified people and dark clouds, all my confidence started disappearing. Then something happened that completely broke me inside. A man standing only a few steps away from me suddenly grabbed my arm tightly. His entire body was shaking. Tears covered his face as he begged me to help him because he could no longer see his wife or children anywhere around him. I stared into his eyes and realized the fear there was genuine. This was not acting. This was not emotional drama. Whatever was happening was real. My throat suddenly became dry. I looked toward my friends expecting them to laugh or explain everything logically like before. But even they looked terrified now. Sani kept staring at the sky silently while Bashir whispered prayers under his breath. The same men who mocked believers loudly on the bus now looked completely helpless. Then the preacher said something that pierced my heart deeply. He explained that physical blindness was terrifying, but spiritual blindness was even more dangerous because many people carried it for years without realizing it. He said pride could make a person reject mercy until darkness finally enters every part of their life. As he spoke, I felt as if invisible hands were squeezing my chest tighter and tighter. Suddenly, my own vision started changing. At first, it was very small. The bright stage lights looked strangely blurry for a second. I blinked hard, thinking dust had entered my eyes because of the strong wind, but instead of improving, the blur became worse. The lights stretched unnaturally. Faces around me lost shape slowly like shadows moving inside smoke. Fear exploded inside me instantly. I rubbed my eyes hard and looked around again, but everything became even darker. At that moment, I knew something terrible was beginning to happen to me. The fear I felt at that moment is something I can never fully explain with ordinary words, because it was unlike anything I had ever experienced before in my life. One minute, I was standing confidently among my friends, trying to appear strong. And the next minute, it felt as if darkness itself was slowly swallowing my sight, little by little. I kept blinking hard, hoping the strange blur would disappear. But instead, the floodlights around the crusade ground became dimmer and dimmer until they looked like weak candles struggling inside thick smoke. The mountains that surrounded the valley started fading away from my vision. Faces around me stretched into strange shadows. Everywhere people were shouting, praying, and running in confusion. Yet all I could focus on was the terrifying realization that something was happening to my eyes. I tried forcing myself to stay calm because I did not want anyone around me to notice my fear. I told myself maybe dust had entered my eyes because of the strong wind blowing across the valley. But deep inside me, another voice kept whispering that this was more than ordinary dust. My chest tightened painfully as panic slowly rose inside me. I rubbed my eyes harder until they began hurting, but the darkness only deepened. The more I struggled, the worse it became. Suddenly, I could barely recognize the faces of my own friends standing beside me. I grabbed Sandy's shirt quickly and asked if the stage lights were becoming dim or if it was only me. The moment he looked into my face, fear entered his own eyes immediately. He held my shoulders tightly and asked why my hands were shaking so badly. I tried speaking calmly, but my voice cracked. I told him I could not see properly anymore. Before he could answer me, another lightning strike flashed across the mountains, followed immediately by a thunder sound so powerful that many people screamed again. Then my vision collapsed completely. It happened faster than I expected. 1 second I could still see faint shadows moving around me, and the next second everything became dark, completely dark. I remember opening my eyes wide in terror, even though I could see absolutely nothing. My heart started beating wildly against my chest. The sounds around me became louder, because my eyes could no longer help me understand where I was. People were pushing everywhere. Chairs scraped against the ground. Women cried loudly. Men shouted prayers with trembling voices. Somewhere nearby, a child screamed for his mother repeatedly. The entire crusade ground had turned into confusion. I stretched my hands forward, desperately trying to touch something familiar. But I accidentally hit someone's shoulder and nearly fell. Fear exploded fully inside me then. I shouted loudly that I could not see. The moment those words left my mouth, something broke inside me emotionally, because I suddenly realized the same thing happening to others had now happened to me too. I stumbled blindly through the crowd while people moved around me in panic. Somebody crashed into me from behind. Another person grabbed my arm briefly before disappearing again into the confusion. Dust entered my mouth as cold wind swept through the valley. My breathing became fast and painful. I had never felt so helpless before in my entire life. Then memories started flooding my mind, one after another. I remembered mocking Christians publicly near the village market. I remembered making fun of my younger sister whenever she woke early to pray. I remembered the day I snatched her Bible from her hands and threw it outside during an argument while she cried helplessly. I remembered laughing at my mother's weak voice when she asked me to allow church members pray for her during her. At that time, I believed I was wiser than everybody else. I believed faith was foolishness, but standing there inside total darkness, none of my pride could help me. For the first time in many years, I felt like a small, frightened child. Then suddenly I heard Mary's voice shouting my name somewhere through the chaos. I cannot describe the relief I felt hearing that familiar voice in the darkness. She kept calling my name repeatedly, while pushing through the terrified crowds searching for me. I stretched my hands desperately toward her voice until finally she grabbed me tightly before I fell to the ground completely. The moment she held me, I broke down emotionally. All my pride disappeared instantly. I started crying openly in front of everybody without caring who was watching. My entire body shook uncontrollably while I held her arms tightly. I kept telling her I was scared because I truly believed at that moment that I might remain blind forever. The darkness around me felt alive and endless. Every proud word I had spoken earlier that evening now felt like knives inside my heart. Mary was crying too, but unlike me, her voice remained calm. She kept praying softly while holding my shaking hands. Then she leaned close to me and gently told me something I will never forget for the rest of my life. She said Jesus was not trying to destroy me the way I feared. She said he was allowing me to see the condition my heart had already been in for many years. She told me pride had blinded me long before darkness touched my eyes physically. Those words pierced me deeply, and for the first time in my life, I stopped arguing with God inside my heart. As Mary held my trembling hands in the middle of that fearful crowd, I felt something happening inside me that I had never experienced before. It was as if every wall of pride I had built around my heart for years was suddenly collapsing all at once. The darkness covering my eyes was terrifying, but the truth that hurt even more was realizing how cruel and stubborn I had become over the years, without admitting it to myself. I had spent so much time mocking believers that I never stopped to ask why my own heart carried so much anger. Standing there helpless and blind among thousands of frightened people, I finally understood that I was not as strong as I always pretended to be. The crusade ground still sounded chaotic around me. Some people continued crying loudly while others prayed with desperate voices. I could hear footsteps running across the dusty field. The strong wind kept blowing against my face while thunder rolled far above the mountains again. Yet somehow, despite all the noise around me, it felt like my heart had entered a quiet place where I could finally see my life clearly for the first time. Mary slowly helped me kneel on the cold ground. I remember feeling small stones pressing painfully against my knees, but I did not care anymore. Tears kept pouring down my face uncontrollably. My breathing shook heavily as shame filled my chest. I started remembering moments I had buried deep inside myself for years. I remembered my mother lying weakly on her bed during her sickness, while Mary prayed beside her faithfully every night. I remembered laughing bitterly and asking why God was still silent if he truly cared. I remembered the pain in Mary's eyes when I insulted her faith. I remembered many nights when I secretly felt empty and angry, but pretended to be confident in front of everyone. Deep down, I had blamed God for every disappointment in my life, even though I never truly knew him personally. For years, bitterness had become my hiding place. And now that bitterness had finally brought me to a place of complete brokenness. As I knelt there shaking, Mary continued praying softly beside me. Her voice sounded full of compassion instead of anger. That confused me deeply because if our positions were reversed, I honestly do not know if I would have shown such mercy to someone who insulted me repeatedly the way I insulted her. Yet she held my shoulders gently and kept encouraging me not to be afraid. Then something happened that changed my life forever. In the middle of my fear and confusion, I suddenly felt an overwhelming conviction inside my heart, unlike anything I had ever experienced before. It did not feel like ordinary guilt. It felt deeper. It was as if every hidden darkness inside me had been exposed completely. I cannot fully explain it, but in that moment, I knew clearly that God had seen every proud word I had spoken, every hateful thought I carried, and every painful thing I had done to others. Yet strangely, along with that conviction, I also felt mercy, not condemnation, mercy. I began crying harder than before. The words that came out of my mouth were not planned prayers or religious speeches. They were simply desperate cries from a broken man who finally realized he needed help. I told God I was tired of fighting him. I admitted I was afraid. I confessed the hatred and pride inside me. I begged him to forgive me if he was truly real. And while I prayed, something strange started happening inside my heart. The fear that had been choking me slowly began fading little by little. The panic inside my chest started calming. Even though I still could not see physically, I suddenly felt less alone in the darkness. It felt as if a heavy burden I had carried secretly for years was slowly lifting away from me. Then I sensed something even more powerful. I cannot explain it perfectly, but deep within me, I felt the presence of Jesus strongly. Not with my physical eyes, but inside my spirit. He revealed to me how close I had come to destroying my own life through pride and hatred. He let me know that many times mercy had been speaking to me through people around me, especially through my sister, but I kept rejecting it. He made me understand that his desire was never to destroy me, but to save me before my heart became completely hardened. Those moments on that cold, dusty ground felt longer than ordinary time. Everything around me faded from my attention. The crowd, the storm, the fear, the noise, none of it mattered anymore. For the first time in my life, my heart truly surrendered completely. And then, while tears still covered my face, something unbelievable started happening to my eyes. While I remained kneeling beside Mary on the cold ground, tears continued falling from my eyes without stopping. My clothes were already covered with dust because of the confusion happening all around us. But at that moment, I no longer cared about appearance or dignity. The same pride that once controlled my life had completely disappeared. All I wanted was mercy. The darkness around my eyes still frightened me deeply, Yet something inside my heart had started changing in a way I could not explain. For the first time in many years, I felt honest before God. I was no longer pretending to be strong or intelligent. I was simply broken. The atmosphere in the valley had also changed strangely. Earlier that night, the crowd was filled with mockery, noise, and arguments. But now everywhere, people were crying out sincerely to God. Some knelt on the ground, praying loudly. Others held one another while weeping openly. I could hear many voices confessing things hidden deep inside of them. The fear that entered the gathering had exposed something inside everybody. Even those who came only to watch casually now sounded serious and shaken. As I stayed there praying weakly, I suddenly noticed something strange happening to the darkness in front of me. At first, it looked like a tiny gray shadow moving somewhere far away. I thought my mind was imagining things because I desperately wanted to see again. But slowly, very slowly, the darkness no longer looked completely black. Faint shapes started appearing like smoke moving across a distant light. My breathing stopped for a moment. I blinked repeatedly. Then I saw another faint shape again. I immediately grabbed Mary's arm tightly and told her something was changing. She held my face carefully with both hands while crying and asking me what I could see. At first, I could barely explain because fear and hope were fighting inside me at the same time. I was afraid to believe too quickly in case the darkness returned again completely. But within a few more moments, the blurry shadows became clearer. The bright crusade lights slowly reappeared. The outline of the mountains returned little by little. Then finally, through watery eyes filled with tears, I saw Mary's face kneeling beside me. The moment I recognized her clearly, I broke down completely again. I covered my mouth with both hands and cried harder than before, because I knew something impossible had just happened to me. Mary also started crying uncontrollably while thanking God repeatedly. Around us, a few people who noticed what happened began shouting praises loudly. Some gathered around us praying. Others simply stared at me with shock written across their faces. I looked around the valley slowly, still trembling with disbelief. The storm clouds above the mountains had started moving away gradually. The strong wind became calmer. The terrible confusion that filled the gathering earlier was slowly settling into silence. Many people remained kneeling on the ground, weeping quietly. Others stood frozen as if deeply lost in thought. Some who had mocked earlier now looked completely broken emotionally. Then my eyes suddenly met the preacher standing on the stage. Even from a distance, I could see tears on his face, too. He was not celebrating proudly like someone trying to show power. Instead, he looked burdened as he prayed softly for the people. That touched me deeply, because in that moment, I realized this night was never about entertainment or proving arguments. Something spiritual had happened that none of us could fully explain naturally. My friends eventually found me again after the confusion reduced. But the men standing before me no longer looked like the same confident mockers who entered the crusade earlier that evening. Sammy's eyes were swollen red from crying. Bashir could barely speak properly because fear still covered his face. When they saw that my sight had returned, both of them looked completely shocked. None of us joked anymore. None of us mocked anybody anymore. As we stood together silently, I realized my entire life had changed in only a few hours. The hatred I carried for years no longer felt powerful inside me. Instead, I felt ashamed remembering the pain I caused others because of my bitterness. I especially thought about my mother and how she continued praying for me even when I insulted her faith repeatedly. I thought about Mary and how she refused to stop loving me despite everything I did against her. That night before the crusade finally ended, I walked quietly to one corner of the valley alone. The mountains around us were still dark, but the sky had become peaceful again. I stood there looking upward while cold air touched my face. Deep inside my heart, I knew I could never return to the person I used to be, because once somebody truly encounters the mercy of God personally, pretending afterward becomes impossible. And as I stood there silently under the night sky, another painful truth finally entered my heart completely. I had spent years believing Christians were blind followers, but the truly blind person all along had been me. When the crusade finally ended late that night, nobody left the valley the same way they came. Earlier people had arrived with excitement, arguments, laughter, and curiosity, but now the entire atmosphere felt heavy and emotional. Many people walked silently as if they were carrying thoughts too deep for words. Others remained behind, near the field, praying quietly in small groups. I remember looking around and seeing faces filled with shock, tears, confusion, and reflection. Even the cold mountain wind felt different to me now. It was as though the valley itself had witnessed something sacred that human words could never fully describe. My friends and I slowly followed the crowd back toward the buses parked along the dusty roadside. Earlier that evening we had been loud and proud, pushing people carelessly and mocking anyone we saw praying. But now none of us could even look properly into each other's eyes. Sandy kept rubbing his face repeatedly as if trying to wake himself from a terrible dream. Bashir walked quietly with his head lowered the entire time. Nobody joked anymore. Nobody laughed anymore. The same mouths that mocked Jesus only hours earlier had become completely silent. Mary walked beside me without speaking much. From time to time, she looked at me carefully as if she still could not believe what had happened to me. I could see relief and gratitude all over her face. At one point during the walk, she suddenly stopped beside the road and began crying softly again. When I asked her why, she explained that for many months she had secretly feared I would die someday without knowing God personally because my heart had become harder each year. She told me there were nights she stayed awake praying for me, long after everybody in our house had slept. Hearing those words broke me deeply inside because I realized how blind I had been to the love surrounding me all along. The journey back to Jos felt completely different from our earlier trip to the crusade. On our way there, the bus had been filled with noise, arguments, and mockery. But on the way back, silence filled almost every seat. Some passengers quietly prayed while staring through the windows into the dark roads outside. Others discussed the terrifying events in whispers. A few people still tried explaining everything naturally, saying perhaps fear and emotion caused the strange blindness people experienced. But even those people sounded uncertain while speaking. As for me, I simply sat quietly beside the window, thinking deeply. I kept replaying the events of the night over and over inside my mind. The screams, the darkness, the fear. The moment I lost my sight completely. The overwhelming peace I felt after surrendering my heart to God. And finally, the moment my vision returned. No matter how many times I thought about it, one truth remained clear inside me. Something real had happened to me spiritually that night. Around midnight, our bus stopped briefly near a roadside market so passengers could buy water and food. While others came down, I remained seated alone. The darkness outside the bus windows reminded me painfully of the darkness I experienced earlier during the crusade. Suddenly, tears filled my eyes again, not because of fear this time, but because of gratitude. I realized that if mercy had not reached me that night, my pride might have destroyed my life completely someday. Then something happened that surprised me deeply. Sani slowly returned to the bus and sat beside me quietly. For several minutes he said nothing. Then finally, with a trembling voice, he confessed that during the confusion at the crusade, he too had become terrified after seeing people suddenly lose their sight around him. He admitted that while I was crying and praying beside Mary, he secretly moved away from the crowd and began praying alone behind one of the buses parked near the field because fear entered his own heart strongly. He told me he could not stop thinking about his life since then. For the first time in our friendship, we spoke honestly with each other. No pride, no mockery, no pretending, just honesty. Before the bus continued moving again, Sani quietly asked me something I never expected to hear from his mouth. He asked whether I truly believed Jesus had forgiven me after everything I had done against Christians and against my own family. I looked at him for a long moment before answering, because I was still trying to understand the mercy I personally experienced myself. Then I told him something from the depth of my heart. I told him the greatest surprise of that night was not the darkness I experienced, but the mercy I found afterward. I explained that when my pride finally broke completely, I did not encounter hatred from God the way I feared. Instead, I encountered forgiveness. Sani became quiet after hearing that, very quiet. And as the bus continued through the dark roads toward home, none of us knew that the hardest part of my journey had not even started yet. Because returning home after such an encounter would force me to face the painful person I used to be. By the time we finally arrived back in Unguardoka the following morning, my body was exhausted, but my mind could still not rest. The sun had already started rising slowly above the village, and people were beginning their normal daily activities. Women swept the compounds in front of their houses, while children ran along the dusty roads carrying buckets of water. Goats wandered freely between mud houses, and the smell of firewood smoke filled the morning air. Everything around me looked normal, yet inside my heart nothing felt normal anymore. It was as if I had returned home as a completely different person wearing the same face. As I walked slowly toward our family house with Mary beside me, fear started growing inside me again, though not the same kind of fear I felt during the crusade. This fear came from shame. I suddenly remembered all the terrible things I had done and said over the years. The people in this village knew me as someone who mocked Christians openly. Many had watched me insult believers publicly near the market square. Some even admired me for it. Now I wondered what they would say if they discovered the same Kareem who mocked Jesus had returned from a crusade, broken and changed. When we entered our compound, the first person I saw was my mother sitting quietly outside near the cooking area. She looked weaker than before because her sickness had reduced her strength greatly over the past year. Yet despite her condition, she still managed to wake early every morning to pray. The moment she saw me walking beside Mary, she smiled gently. But then her expression changed immediately when she noticed the tears still visible in my eyes. I cannot explain what happened inside me at that moment. For years I had hardened myself emotionally, especially around my family. I rarely apologized to anyone because pride always controlled me. But the moment I looked at my mother sitting there weak and tired, all the guilt I carried suddenly became unbearable. Without even thinking, I rushed toward her and fell to my knees directly in front of her. Then I started crying again. My mother became frightened immediately and kept asking what happened during the crusade. But before Mary could answer, I held my mother's hands tightly and began begging her to forgive me for the pain I caused her over the years. I confessed how bitter and angry I had become after her sickness. I admitted how cruelly I treated Mary because of my hatred toward Christianity. I told her I was ashamed of the person I had become. My mother also began crying. She touched my face gently while tears rolled down her cheeks, and through her broken voice she explained something that shocked me deeply. She said she never stopped praying for me, even during the periods when I insulted her faith directly to her face. She said many nights she cried before God, asking him not to allow bitterness destroy my future completely. She revealed to me that several times she almost lost hope because my heart kept growing harder each year. Hearing those words crushed me emotionally. At that moment, I finally understood something important. People had been fighting for my soul in prayer long before I realized it myself. That morning became one of the most emotional moments our family had ever experienced together. Mary eventually explained everything that happened during the crusade, while my mother listened in shock. When she heard about my blindness and how my sight returned later, she covered her mouth and cried quietly for a long time. Then she lifted her weak hands toward heaven and began thanking God repeatedly. But not everybody in the village reacted the same way. As news spread over the following days, many people became curious about my sudden change. Some neighbors visited our house asking questions about the crusade. Others whispered secretly that fear had simply manipulated my emotions. A few openly mocked me the same way I once mocked believers myself. Some men who used to sit with me at Al-Haji Bako's tea shop laughed and claimed Christianity had confused my mind. Those reactions hurt me deeply at first, especially because I understood exactly how they thought. I used to speak exactly like them. One afternoon, while passing through the village market, I overheard two young men joking about me. One of them laughed loudly and said the enemy of Christians had now become one of them. People nearby laughed along with him. The shame I felt in that moment was painful. Part of me wanted to react angrily the way I normally would before, but something inside me stopped me. Instead, I quietly continued walking. And as I walked home that evening under the orange sunset, another painful realization entered my heart. Following God would not only require changing my words, it would require changing my entire life. And deep down, I knew that journey was only beginning. The weeks after the crusade became some of the hardest and most emotional days of my life, because I was no longer fighting only with people around me. I was now fighting with the person I used to be. Every morning when I woke up, that night in the mountain valley returned strongly to my mind. Sometimes I still heard the screams of terrified people inside my head. Sometimes I remembered the darkness covering my eyes and the fear that nearly destroyed me emotionally. Other times I remembered the strange peace I felt after surrendering my heart to God. No matter how hard I tried to ignore those memories, they followed me everywhere. At first, I tried keeping my experience private because I feared people's reactions. In our village, many already knew me as someone who hated Christianity strongly. Suddenly changing openly would bring mockery, arguments, and questions I did not yet feel ready to answer. So, for several days I avoided many of my old friends and spent most of my time helping my mother around the house quietly. But inside me, something kept growing stronger each day. I started reading the Bible secretly at night, the same Bible I once mocked. Sometimes I read alone in Mary's room after everyone slept. Other times I sat outside under the quiet night sky with a small lantern beside me while reading slowly. At first I struggled to understand many things, but certain passages pierced my heart deeply because they described my condition perfectly. Every time I read about pride, forgiveness, mercy, and repentance, it felt as if God was speaking directly into my life story. One night while reading quietly, I suddenly reached a passage describing how some people have physical eyes, yet remain spiritually blind. The moment I read those words, my body became cold because they reminded me exactly of what happened during the crusade. I sat there silently for a long time, staring at the pages while tears filled my eyes again. Deep inside me, I knew I could no longer pretend that my encounter meant nothing. Then another struggle started. I began feeling convicted about the many people I had hurt in the past. Faces kept appearing in my mind repeatedly. Christians I mocked publicly. Young believers I discouraged. My own sister whom I embarrassed many times in front of others. Even my mother who continued loving me despite my harshness. The more I prayed and read the Bible, the heavier those memories became. Finally, one afternoon I decided to visit a man named Pastor Samuel, who lived near the edge of our village. Months earlier I had publicly argued with him near the market and insulted his church members badly. I still remember the humiliation on his face that day. Walking toward his house now felt difficult because shame followed every step I took. Several times I almost turned back, but something inside me refused to allow me continue hiding. When I finally reached his compound, my hands were shaking badly. The pastor looked surprised seeing me standing at his gate, because the last time we met, I left angrily after insulting him publicly. For a few moments neither of us spoke. Then before fear could stop me, I apologized to him sincerely for everything I had done. To my surprise, Pastor Samuel did not react with anger. Instead, tears entered his eyes immediately. He invited me inside his small sitting room, and for nearly 2 hours we talked deeply about my experience at the crusade and the changes happening inside my heart. He listened carefully without judging me. Then he explained something that stayed with me permanently afterward. He said, many people believe transformation happens instantly after encountering God. But the truth is that healing the heart often becomes a journey of daily surrender and growth. Those words comforted me greatly because I still felt weak and confused many times. Before I left his house that evening, Pastor Samuel prayed for me quietly. During that prayer, I felt peace again strongly inside my heart. He encouraged me not to allow shame or fear push me backward into my old life. He also warned me that some people would mock my testimony because they could not understand what truly happened to me spiritually. And he was right. As the months passed, reactions around the village became divided. Some people became curious and started asking me questions privately about the crusade. Others avoided me completely because my transformation confused them. A few old friends became angry because I no longer joined them in mocking believers or insulting Christianity openly. But despite all those struggles, one thing became impossible for me to deny. I could no longer hide what God had done in my life. The same mouth that once mocked Jesus now desired to speak about his mercy. And slowly, without fully realizing it, I started becoming the kind of person I once hated. It has been many years now since that terrifying night in the mountain valley outside Cafe Khan. But even today, whenever I close my eyes, I can still remember every detail clearly. I still remember the cold wind moving through the crowd. I still remember the sound of thunder shaking the mountains. I still remember the screams of people crying in fear when darkness suddenly covered their eyes. Most importantly, I still remember the exact moment pride finally broke inside my heart, and I realized how spiritually blind I had been for many years without knowing it. Today, Whenever people hear my testimony, many ask me the same question. They ask whether I believe God punished me that night. But honestly, after everything I experienced, I do not see it that way anymore. Deep inside my heart, I believe mercy reached me before destruction could. I believe God allowed me to experience physical darkness for a short moment, so I could finally recognize the deeper darkness already living inside me for years. If that night never happened, I honestly do not know where my hatred and bitterness would have led me eventually. My life after that encounter did not suddenly become perfect. I still faced difficult seasons. My mother eventually passed away peacefully some years later, but before she died, she saw me publicly serving God with the same passion I once used to fight against him. That brought her great joy during her final days. Mary also remained one of the strongest spiritual influences in my life. Even today, whenever I remember how patiently she prayed for me despite my cruelty toward her, I become emotional because her love reflected the mercy of Christ to me, long before I understood it myself. There were also moments when people continued mocking my testimony. Some accused me of inventing the story. Others claimed fear and emotions manipulated my mind during the crusade. But honestly, I no longer argue with such people the way I once argued with believers myself. Why? Because I understand something now that I did not understand before. A hardened heart can reject even the clearest warning until mercy finally opens the eyes. That is why whenever I speak publicly today, especially to young people filled with anger, pride, and bitterness, I always tell them something very important. I tell them not to wait for painful moments before turning their hearts toward God. Many people think spiritual blindness only belongs to evil people, but that is not true. Sometimes it begins quietly through pride, hatred, unforgiveness, secret pain, disappointment, jealousy, or constant mockery of holy things. Little by little, the heart becomes hard without the person realizing it. I also encourage believers everywhere never to stop praying for people they love, even when those people seem impossible to change. If Mary and my mother had given up on me, perhaps my story would have ended very differently. Their prayers became part of the reason mercy found me before it was too late. Sometimes the people who fight against God the most are secretly carrying deep wounds inside them. Instead of hating such people completely, believers must continue showing love, patience, and truth while trusting God to work on their hearts. And to every Christian reading or listening to my testimony today, I want to say this carefully from the depth of my heart. Never become careless in your walk with God. Pray faithfully even when nobody notices. Study God's word sincerely. Guard your heart against pride. Love one another genuinely, because this world is already filled with hatred and darkness. Do not only act like Christians publicly, while your heart slowly moves far away from God secretly. Stay humble. Stay prayerful. Stay close to Jesus daily, because nobody truly understands how much spiritual battles surround human lives every single day. Sometimes people ask me what the scariest part of that entire experience was. Was it the darkness? Was it the fear? Was it losing my sight temporarily? And my answer is always the same. The scariest moment of my life was not when my physical eyes stopped seeing. It was the moment I realized my heart had already been blind long before that night. And even now, whenever I finish sharing this testimony in churches, homes, or small gatherings, the room usually becomes very quiet because deep down many people begin asking themselves one serious question. What if the warnings we keep ignoring today are actually God's mercy trying to save us before it becomes too late?